Under a city near the Dead Sea, buried in a layer of ash 5 feet thick, archaeologists found human bone that had been shattered and scattered, pottery melted like candle wax, and sand grains cracked by a pressure that normally only forms miles underground. For years, the destruction got filed under war, or fire, or an earthquake. Then a team measured the heat trapped in that layer. It had topped 2,000 degrees Celsius. Nothing that walks the earth, no army, no furnace, no burning building, gets that hot. So what did? This story doesn't start with the ash. It starts with the city that was standing before the ash fell, and how good life there had been. The place is called Tal el Hammam. It sits in the southern Jordan Valley, on a flat, fertile plain just northeast of the Dead Sea, in what is now the country of Jordan. Archaeologists call this stretch of land the Middle Gore. In the Bronze Age, it was some of the richest farmland anywhere in the region, watered by the Jordan River, thick with grain and orchards. Ancient people called the whole disk of green ground the Kikar, the disk of the Jordan. For more than 2,000 years, people lived here without a break. The excavation team that dug the site, led by Stephen Collins of Trinity Southwest University, found that Tal el Hammam was lived in without a break for at least 2,500 years. That is longer than the gap between us and the Roman Empire. Generation after generation, the same ground, the same walls, the same view of the water. And it was not a village. Tal el Hammam was the biggest walled city for miles around, 10 times larger than nearby Jericho by some measures. It had a palace complex that rose 4 or 5 stories into the air, built of mudbrick. It had a defensive rampart, an earthen wall packed around the upper city, about 4 meters thick. Tens of thousands of people lived in and around it, farming the plain, trading along the valley. Hold that picture, because everything that follows leans on it. A large, wealthy, heavily built city. A place that had survived every ordinary disaster the Bronze Age could throw at it, for 25 centuries. And then, in what the evidence suggests was a single moment, it stopped. When the archaeologists dug down through the mound, they found the story written in the dirt. Layer on layer of ordinary life, floors and walls and broken pots, the slow buildup of centuries. And then one clear line where all of that ends. That line is a band of dark material about 1.5 meters thick, 5 feet of charcoal, ash, and broken debris, capping the entire city at once. Not one building, not one neighborhood, but the whole thing, from the palace down to the humblest house, sealed under the same burnt blanket at the same moment. The palace took the worst of it. The team reported that the upper 12 meters or more of that 4 to 5 story building were simply gone, sheared off and thrown outward, leaving only the lower courses of brick. The 4-meter rampart, the thick wall that had protected the city for generations, was flattened. Whatever hit this place did not knock it over. It erased the top of it. Now, a burnt layer by itself is not a mystery. Cities burned all the time in the ancient world. Armies sacked them, lamps tipped over, earthquakes brought fires. The team knew that. So they did not stop at the city burned. They started asking what kind of fire and how hot and coming from which direction. And here's the detail that everyone missed at first. The debris was not scattered at random. When the researchers mapped where the broken potsherds, the charred grain, the charcoal, and the bone fragments ended up, a pattern came out of the ground. The material had been thrown in a clear line, from the southwest to the northeast. It was as if a single, huge wave of force had rolled across the city in one direction and swept everything ahead of it. That is not what a burning building does. A house fire goes up. An army works its way through a city street by street over hours or days. This was one push, one direction, one instant, strong enough to carry the wreckage of a whole city across the plain like leaves in front of a storm. There's a reason this site keeps scientists arguing years later, because the next thing they found in that layer is the kind of evidence that usually only turns up in 2 places on Earth, and neither of them is a city. They found shocked quartz. To understand why that word matters, you have to understand what quartz is. Quartz is one of the hardest common minerals on the planet. It is the gritty stuff in ordinary sand. You cannot crack its inner structure by heating it, or hitting it with a hammer, or setting a house on fire on top of it. To leave the kind of cracks the team was looking at, you need a sudden, violent shock. They measured pressures of 5 to 10 gigapascals in that quartz. That is thousands of times the pressure of the air around you, delivered in an instant. James Kennett, a scientist on the team and an emeritus professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, put it plainly. He said shocked quartz forms only under very high pressure, that quartz is very hard to shock, and that finding it in this layer meant incredible forces had been at work. In nature, that level of shock shows up around meteor impacts and cosmic airbursts. It also shows up at nuclear test sites. It does not show up in the ruins of a city that lost a war. So we have a 5-foot burn layer, a palace with its top torn off, a rampart flattened, debris blown in one direction, and cracked quartz that should not be there. On their own, each of these could maybe be argued away. Stacked together, they start to point somewhere strange, and the team was not done. The next question was temperature. How hot did this layer actually get? To answer that, the researchers took melted material from the site and ran heating experiments in the lab, warming samples until they matched what the ancient material looked like. The number they came back with was brutal. The heat in that destruction layer had exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. Let that land for a moment. 2,000 degrees is hotter than flowing lava. It is hotter than a house fire, hotter than a pottery kiln, hotter than a burning oil store, hotter than anything the people of this city could have built or lit. And the evidence for it was everywhere in the layer. Pottery had melted and bubbled. Mudbricks, sun-dried clay, had slumped and fused. The plaster on the palace walls had cooked into tiny round beads of calcium carbonate. And the researchers found droplets of melted metal in the dirt, tiny beads of platinum, iridium, nickel, gold, silver, along with melted zircon and chromite, minerals that need staggering heat to melt. Some of the metals in that list melt only at temperatures far beyond any ordinary fire. The team compared the melted material from the palace to glass produced at the Trinity site in New Mexico, the place where the first atomic bomb was tested in 1945. The blast there fused the desert sand into a glassy crust. The researchers were careful about what they meant by that. They did not claim a bomb went off at Tal el Hammam. They claimed that whatever hit the city left the same signature of instant, extreme heat that a nuclear-scale blast leaves behind. That's the kind of number that stops an archaeologist cold, and it leads straight into the strangest evidence of all. In among the melted mud and the burnt grain, the team reported finding tiny beads of glass, melt glass, formed when material is flashed into liquid and then hardens in the air. They found microscopic iron-rich and silica-rich spherules, little spheres that form when melted rock is thrown up and cools as it falls. And they reported finding diamond-like carbon, sometimes called diamondoids, tiny bits of carbon squeezed and heated into a diamond-like form. That last one matters because of where else it shows up. Diamond-like carbon and its cousins have been used as markers of cosmic impacts before. Scientists have pointed to them at the boundary layer left by the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. They have argued for them at the Younger Dryas boundary, a mysterious cold snap almost 13,000 years ago that some researchers linked to a comet. Now the same fingerprint was being reported in the dirt of a Bronze Age town. We keep saying the team reported, and that is deliberate, because every one of these claims would soon be fought over. Keep that in the back of your mind. For now, follow where the evidence was pointing them. Because the hardest part of this layer to look at is not the glass or the metal, it is the people. Scattered through the debris field, the excavators found human remains, not laid out in graves, not resting where they fell asleep. The bones were described in the study as showing extreme disarticulation and skeletal fragmentation. In plain terms, bodies had been torn apart and broken up. The pieces were flung and mixed into the wreckage, ending up in the same southwest to northeast pattern as the pottery and the grain. You'd think a detail like that would settle the mood of any dig. It settled nothing about the cause, but it told the team what the last instant in this city may have been like for the people who were standing in it. Whatever came, it came fast, and it came with force enough to treat human bodies the way it treated mud brick walls. So the team had their pile of evidence, a 5-foot burn layer over the whole city at once, a palace decapitated, a rampart flattened, debris blown in one clean direction, shocked quartz, heat past 2,000 degrees, melted metals, melt glass, spherules, diamond-like carbon, human bone shattered and scattered. The question was no longer whether something violent happened. The question was what single event could do all of that in one moment. And the answer they reached for came from the sky. Their proposed answer was a cosmic airburst. An airburst is what happens when a chunk of rock or ice from space comes screaming into the atmosphere and explodes in the air before it ever hits the ground. It does not leave a crater, because it never lands as one solid piece. It detonates overhead, sending down a blast of heat and a wall of pressurized air moving faster than sound. The fireball can be hotter than the surface of the sun for a fraction of a second, and the shock wave can flatten everything below it. The world has actually seen this happen. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, over a remote stretch of Siberia called Tunguska, something exploded in the sky. There was no crater, and no clear piece of the object was ever recovered, but the blast flattened around 80 million trees, across more than 800 square miles of forest, snapping them at the trunk and laying them flat, all pointing outward from a single center, like spokes on a wheel. Herders miles away were thrown off their feet, and the flash of it was seen across the countryside. Scientists estimate the object was only about 50 meters across, roughly the width of a city block, and that it detonated with something like 1,000 times the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And notice what Tunguska did not leave behind. No hole in the ground, no lump of space rock sitting in a field. If you went looking for a crater the day after, you would have found nothing but fallen trees, which is exactly the problem with proving an airburst thousands of years later. The event hides the obvious clue. What it leaves instead is the burned, shocked, melted fingerprint in the ground. And that fingerprint is precisely what the Tal el-Hammam team said they were reading. Nobody was killed at Tunguska, because almost nobody lived there. The researchers at Tal el-Hammam argued that a similar event, and by their reading an even larger one, went off over a city packed with tens of thousands of people. To test the idea, they ran computer simulations, modeling a low-altitude blast whose fireball reaches down close to the ground. In those models, the researchers described a shock front racing outward at many kilometers a second, faster than anything a natural ground event can produce, carrying enough energy at the surface to flash sand and rock straight into glass. They reported that the modeled results matched the pattern of melting, shock, and destruction they saw in the dirt. In their own words, the geology and the archaeology pointed to a super Tunguska-scale airburst as the most likely cause. And here is where the story stops being only about one terrible morning, because the destruction did not end when the fires went out. Something in that layer kept the land dead for centuries afterward, and the culprit the team pointed to was salt. When they analyzed the destruction layer, they found salt concentrations of around 4% by weight, far above anything you would expect in ordinary farm soil. Their explanation was that the blast, or debris from it, drove a spray of salt across the plain, vaporized brine and salt from the nearby Dead Sea and its shores, and dumped it onto the fields. The rich farmland that had fed the city for 2,500 years became poisoned ground. Salt-soaked soil does not grow grain. It barely grows anything. The pattern in the wider valley fits that grim idea. The researchers mapped the whole southern Jordan Valley and found that Tal el-Hammam was not the only place that emptied out. All 16 of the major settled sites in the area, along with more than 100 smaller villages, appear to have been abandoned at roughly the same time, around 1650 BC. The population of the region is estimated to have crashed from tens of thousands of people down to maybe a few hundred wandering herders. An area that had been one of the most crowded, richest corners of the ancient world went silent. In the study's own map of what it called the 16 cities of the plain, the ruined zone stretches across more than a quarter of the southern Jordan Valley, reaching out beyond 25 kilometers from the city. The ground they marked carries salt levels of about 1 1/3% or higher, which is high enough to kill most food crops outright. That is the difference between a valley you can farm and a valley you have to walk away from. And it stayed silent for a very long time. The researchers describe an enigmatic gap of 300 to 600 years, sometimes called the Late Bronze Age gap, in the lower valley, when the great cities of the plain simply were not lived in. Jericho, the famous walled town a short way off, was only lightly resettled about 300 years later. The town of Tal Nimrin came back around 500 years later. Tal el-Hammam itself, the biggest of them all, was not truly lived in again for something like 600 years. Whatever happened here did not just destroy a city. It erased a civilization from a whole stretch of the map and kept people away for centuries. Now, if you grew up hearing a certain old story, some of these details may be starting to sound familiar. A wicked city on the plain near the Dead Sea, fire and destruction falling from the sky. The land left barren, and salt everywhere, salt. That is the connection that made this site famous far beyond archaeology. Stephen Collins, the excavation director, has argued for years that Tal el-Hammam is the best candidate for the biblical city of Sodom. In a 2013 article in Biblical Archaeology Review, he laid out his case based on the city's size, its location on the Kikkar, the disk of the Jordan, and the timing and manner of its destruction. In the old account, Sodom is one of the cities of the plain, destroyed in a rain of fire and brimstone, its people wiped out in a morning. When Lot and his family flee, his wife looks back at the burning cities and is turned into a pillar of salt. The Airburst researchers did not claim to prove that story. What they suggested, carefully, was that a real catastrophe on this plane, a genuine fire from the sky and a genuine curse of salt over the fields, could have burned itself into human memory. Passed down by word of mouth for generations, the story of a city destroyed from above might have survived as oral tradition and eventually been written down as the fall of Sodom, a memory of a real disaster that, over centuries, turned into scripture. It is a striking idea. It is also, we should be honest, a deeply contested one. Many mainstream biblical scholars place Sodom elsewhere, often at sites south of the Dead Sea, and reject the identification of Tal el-Hammam as Sodom entirely. The Sodom link was never settled science. It was one team's interpretation, laid over a set of physical findings, and plenty of experts never accepted it. But the interpretation is one thing, the dirt is another. And the fight that broke out was not really about scripture. It was about whether the physical evidence, the quartz, the glass, the heat, the airburst itself, held up at all. Because not everyone who read that 2021 paper was convinced, not even close. The study had been published in September 2021 in Scientific Reports, a large, well-known journal. It drew enormous attention, headlines around the world, the Sodom angle splashed across the internet. And almost immediately, other scientists began pulling at the threads. In March 2022, two geologists, Scott Jarrett and R. Scott Harris, published a formal response. They argued that the evidence did not meet the well-established criteria for proving a cosmic airburst. They questioned the shocked quartz in particular, suggesting that the cracks in the grains could come from ordinary geological stress rather than a blast from space, and that the way the grains had been examined was not enough to prove a shock origin. In their reading, the mineral and chemical evidence simply did not show what the team said it showed. Then the physicists came for the comparison itself. Mark Boslow, a specialist in asteroid impacts and airbursts, and a co-author named Andrew Bruno, argued in 2025 that the study had misunderstood the Tunguska event and the basic physics of shock waves. They said the temperatures, wind speeds, and blast effects had been overestimated, partly because the paper leaned on older numbers about Tunguska that were themselves too high. If the yardstick you are measuring against is wrong, everything you build on it wobbles. And there was a separate, more uncomfortable line of criticism. Elizabeth Bick, a microbiologist known for spotting problems in scientific images, examined the photographs in the paper. She concluded that several images of the dig appeared to contain cloned sections, small areas that seemed to repeat within the same photo, and she raised questions about why the pictures looked the way they did. Boslow went through the paper publicly, point by point, calling out what he saw as errors. Critics began describing the whole thing, bluntly, as pseudoscience dressed up in a famous Bible story. The journal moved slowly. In February 2023, the editors attached a note to the paper, warning readers that concerns had been raised about the data and the conclusions, and that they were looking into it. That note sat there for 2 more years while the argument raged. Then, on April 24, 2025, Scientific Reports formally retracted the paper. In the retraction note, the editors laid out their reasoning. They pointed to the critique by Jarrett and Harris about errors in the methods, the analysis, and the interpretation of the mineral and chemical data. They pointed to Boslow and Bruno's argument that the comparison to Tunguska was not properly supported, and they wrote the sentence that, in the world of science, is close to a death blow. Given these concerns, they said, the editors no longer had confidence that the conclusions were reliable. The paper that had told the world a cosmic blast may have destroyed Sodom was pulled from the record. For a lot of stories, that would be the ending. Paper retracted, case closed, move on. But that's not what happened here, and this is the part that keeps the whole thing alive. Because the authors did not back down, not 1 inch. The corresponding author, Alan West, said flatly that he and his co-authors strongly disagreed with the retraction. He accused a small but vocal group of scientists of trying to shut down discussion of the Tal el-Hammam airburst, and said that doing so undermined the very idea of open scientific inquiry. Another co-author, George Howard, called the journal's decision a profoundly disappointing and, in his word, disgusting turn of events. On the retraction note itself, a long list of the original authors is recorded as formally disagreeing with the decision to pull their work. More than that, they went back to the field and the lab. West said the team would republish the original article with new data, and they have pushed out expanded versions of the work through other outlets, adding new modeling and new findings, arguing the Airburst case in even more detail than before. In his words, the critics thought they could suppress the discussion, and they failed, and the team would simply go around them so the debate about these dangerous airbursts could continue. One of the original authors, the geologist Ted Bunch, has since died, but the surviving team has kept fighting for the idea. So who is right? That is the honest, uncomfortable answer at the center of this story. We do not fully know. The critics say the evidence was mishandled and the physics misread, and a major journal agreed strongly enough to retract. The original team says the criticism is a campaign, the core findings are solid, and the melted pottery and shocked minerals are still sitting there in the ground, arguing on their behalf. Both sides are trained scientists. Both are looking at the same layer of ash near the Dead Sea, and they cannot agree on what burned it. What is not really in dispute is that something ended Tal el Hammam. The 5-foot destruction layer is real. The abandoned cities of the plain are real. The salt in the soil and the centuries of silence are real. Tens of thousands of people did vanish from this valley, around 1650 BC, and the richest farmland in the region did go dead for hundreds of years. The fight is over the cause, over whether the fingerprints in that layer point to the sky or to something more ordinary that we have not fully explained yet. Think about that for a second. 3,600 years after this city died, its ash is still hot enough to start a war among scientists. Go back to where we started. A layer of dark earth, 5 feet thick, under a mound near the Dead Sea. Human bone shattered and scattered through it. Pottery melted like wax. Sand cracked by a pressure that does not belong in a city. And a measured heat that topped 2,000 degrees, hotter than any fire those people could have made. We told you nothing on the ground gets that hot, and then we spent this whole story on the question of what came from above. That question is not closed. The paper that answered it was pulled, and the people who wrote it refused to accept that it is wrong. The evidence they argue over has not moved. It is still in the ground, near the Dead Sea, waiting for someone to dig deeper and prove the case one way or the other. So we will leave you with the same question the scientists cannot put down. If it was not fire from the sky that ended this city in a single burning morning, then what was it? And why can the sharpest minds in the field still not agree on the answer? Tell us in the comments where you land, sky, or something else. We read everyone. And if a real disaster near the Dead Sea could survive as the story of Sodom, it makes you wonder how many other old legends are burnt memories of something that actually happened.